Hi, I'm Alistair Shipley. Driven by the beliefs that everyone has something special to offer, I created Not So Average, the podcast that proves that you don't need to be in the top 1% to be truly extraordinary. Each episode spotlights everyday people from your community, the very individuals you might pass on the street. These relatable stories reveal that whether you're a jack of all trades or a niche specialist, we all have unique experiences and valuable lessons to share. Imagine if we all took a moment to realize we're all not so average. Let's get after it. Today's guest is one of those rare people who spent her life building things you don't always see but feel impact of everywhere. Jordana Armstrong has shaped Alberta's social innovation landscape from her decade at Innovate Calgary to now advising at the University of Maryland and Washington, D.C. She's a strategic thinker, an angel investor, and a systems level builder who's always asking, how can we do better for everyone? In this episode, we get into what social innovation really means, why Alberta still has untapped potential, and what it's like to carry a global lens while staying rooted in community impact. This one's for the builders, the rethinkers, and anyone dreaming of a better future. Welcome.
Thank you. And I have to say, you need to write intros for everyone.
I'm trying. I openly admit this is kind of a component that I pull together what I want, and then obviously AI does help.
Great.
But yeah. I'm happy to do this for LinkedIn if you need.
Wonderful. I appreciate it.
So for those unfamiliar, how would you describe social innovation and why does it matter now more than ever?
I mean, now more than ever, just look at what's happening around the world, from climate change, massive migration, rising inequality. I think we're not talking enough about how much inequality is going to impact. And we're seeing it in political movements and the social unrest that's starting to unfold, because when people don't have the ability to create a sustainable livelihood for themselves, you know what happens? They look for solutions, and they often grab at whatever solution is being sold to them or right in front of their face. So yeah, it's important to be thinking long term, and what social innovation offers is a perspective around how do we innovate in an integrated way? How do we observe the systems around us, which are sometimes invisible or unseen, the interconnectivity of those systems, and then to innovate within that kind of complexity. So one of my favorite social innovation thinkers, Dr. Frances Wesley at Waterloo, she's retired now, but kind of the grandmother of social innovation in Canada, I would say. She talks about social innovation as both a journey and a destination. It's about thinking about that end goal, you know, what kind of future do we want to create, as I talked about, but then also the process of how we get there. So are we building with community, just like in the tech world? Are you building with your customers and your stakeholders? Are you building solutions that folks really need, or are you trying to, you know, fit a round peg in a square hole, so to speak? So it's about that kind of integrated thinking and being aware of the unintended consequences of how we innovate. So we've got to do things, we've got to try things, we've got to break things, but we also want to be mindful of both those intended and unintended consequences. And I think thinking about the complexity of our systems is a really good way to be honest with ourselves about those unintended consequences.
Okay. Is social innovation generally something that a corporation looks at? Is it something that an institution like a university? Is it a government? Is it, kind of go into that. Is it more of a mindset?
I would say any type of organization or individual can be working on socially innovative solutions. One of my favorite kind of government innovations is universal healthcare. Like we think of universal healthcare in Canada as something that we always had, but it actually started as a pilot in Saskatchewan. And through the intentional actions of builders and government and folks thinking about scaling up that pilot to a Canadian level, it's now something that we just think of as the way that our healthcare system works.
As a Canadian.
And I would say, you know, unintended consequences, it's not a perfect system for sure. But as we'll talk about, I was just in the United States and I found it really difficult to access healthcare, you know, because I had to wait 3 months to have access to benefits. And I had to go to the doctor to get a shot before I went down to South Africa. And I didn't really want to pay $250 just to see the doctor and then another I think they said quoted me $650 to bring in this specific vaccine, and so I just didn't get the shot. I'm fine, obviously, but like dropping $1,000 for something that you may or may not need, I could do it if I had to. But
that's the perfect embodiment, though, of that gamble that people take by not having universal health care because of the price that it would cost them. So they weigh their health against the financial cost.
Exactly.
That's crazy. That just happened right there.
And then they end up, potentially in the hospital, which is a larger cost to the system. So if we think about the way that the decisions that we make or the innovations that we're trying to cultivate, what are those trickle-down impacts of those inventions, let's call it? That's a policy invention.
Yeah, that's really cool. What first pulled you towards this space? Was there a moment where it kind of clicked for you that you were like, this is my lane that I want to run in?
I guess like if social innovation was an industry, and it is sort of industrialized in some ways in Canada, you've got government level organizations, as you said, corporations and different units that focus on social innovation. That sort of came to me post-university when I was interested in bridging between technology and innovation and societal impact. And I kind of found that space and started to take programs and learn more about complex systems and that kind of thing. And as I said, we stand on the shoulders of giants. There's a lot of folks in the Canadian ecosystem. The McConnell Foundation, as an example.
Where's that based out of?
It's based out of Montreal.
Oh, cool.
They founded a ton of initiatives all across Canada that are really focused on how do we innovate in these complex social systems for the betterment of society. But me personally, I accidentally observed complex systems as a young kid. I grew up in a family where one side of the family were entrepreneurs and they had done really well. The other side of the family were farmers and we really struggled. I grew up with my mom and also being kind of rural. So I grew up in Edmonton, but my family was still quite rural, kind of west of Edmonton. And, the things that I observed in those communities, we talk about access to healthcare. Well, even though we're in a public system, when folks really don't have access to resources, it's tricky. Those communities are almost still living in, the communities I observed are still almost living in barter systems sometimes,
Oh, wow.
I'll trade eggs for you to come help me fix my well. And I think that's amazing. There's a lot of benefits to that, but it's also out of need and necessity, not necessarily out of will. So that's tricky. And so I had observed that at a young age. Neither side of my family it was just the external circumstances that created where they were at. And so I was like, okay, well, what's going on here? Then I went off to university and was able to study more about political economy and understand a little bit more, develop the language, as I said. And so that's what brought me there. I had a really deep desire to shift what was happening around me and just to make things a bit more equitable for people who otherwise don't have access or don't have power.
Interesting. So upbringing, and then you had the ability to go to school for it, so that helped out quite a bit.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. And I had some support from family to go to school, so very lucky to do that.
You've helped shape social innovation hubs, funds, and programs across Alberta. What are you most proud of from that chapter with Innovate Calgary?
The first thing I'll say that I'm most proud of is the culture that we developed on our team. The folks that I was able to work with, the folks that I hired. I'm most proud of that because, we talked a little bit earlier about what social innovation is, and social innovation is about people who actually care to be active participants in their society and actively change things around them for the betterment of other folks. And so being able to foster an environment where people could come and work in those ways, in those spaces, we were very intentional about creating a culture of transparency. And, we talked about candor a little bit earlier, lots of candor on our team. And it was noticeable. And that's something I'd like to carry forward. And, you asked that in the context of social innovation and the initiatives that we developed. But I also think it's the embodiment of social innovation. We talked about social innovation as a journey and a destination. Being able to develop that team culture and be mindful of creating space for people to solve problems around them, that is part of the journey. Transforming cultures, building organizations where people are seen, people can be active, developers of solutions, and then carry that forward into the other teams that they participate in. I think one of the challenges in institutions, Innovate Calgary is sort of embedded at the University of Calgary. It's a big institution, large corporations. We've sort of stripped the humanity out of these organizations by how do I frame this? I think we've stripped the humanity out of these organizations because we look at humans as resources. Partly that's true, but we don't look at them as human beings necessarily. And, in the wave of what's going to happen with, the disruption of jobs and AI and all of that stuff, we have this opportunity to rethink, like, what is the role of the human being in work and in society in the future? And so that would be the first thing. Going back to sort of the actual initiatives themselves, I'm really proud of the Social Impact Fund for a couple of reasons. But the main reason is that we tried to innovate. We tried to think strategically about what kind of capital people needed access to, and then approaches to getting people that access to capital. So as an example, we developed it's not super novel, but I haven't seen it used much in Alberta. Now it's being used a bit more, but a revenue-based loan so that we could invest in companies that we weren't sure would be venture backable, but we still wanted to be that early stage capital partner.
Okay.
And so
were these like convertible debt?
Yes, exactly. Okay. Convertible debt. And we could convert to equity later if they did end up raising venture capital. Also not a perfect instrument, but just trying to think about, okay, what is the actual need of the entrepreneur and how do we meet them where they're at? I guess
having that option is huge though for companies. Totally. If they didn't have that access to funds, that's a life preserver for a lot of companies at that stage too.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I guess the last thing, I'm proud of a lot. There were a lot of things that went wrong as well. But on the Social Innovation Hub, I think similar story, we were just trying to be really intentional about meeting entrepreneurs where they're at. So I did a lot of customer discovery, talked to a lot of entrepreneurs. The number one thing I heard from folks is, please God, don't give me another program. And that, that happens a lot in these innovation ecosystems because our metrics incentivize us to run these cohort-based programs so that we can hit these numbers. These incubators, accelerators, And I think those are they're very important, don't get me wrong. And there's a lot of great foundational programs, foundational learning for entrepreneurs, mentoring programs like Venture Mentoring Service of Alberta. Like there's great stuff. And sometimes entrepreneurs just need to solve the problem that's right in front of them. Yeah. And so what we were trying to innovate with is how do we think about the hub itself as a massive incubator accelerator without having time-bound programming. So an entrepreneur comes to us, they have a problem. Can we put them in front of the right industry X? Can we help them connect to a mentor? Can we help them connect to a peer if maybe what they're struggling with is related to their mental health? We develop mental health programming, just in partnership with Collectively Tangled, who you should have on this podcast if you haven't already.
Shout out to Collectively Tangled. Yes.
So that, I guess, what I'm most proud of in summary is the culture that we developed and then just innovating to meet folks where they were at.
I like that a lot. The incubation space is so interesting. So I haven't shared this too much, but part of the reason why I moved down to San Francisco was as a part of 500 startups. 500 based in Mountain View, California, not the derivatives that have come from it since. So it was batch 15. So not exactly like OG, but pretty early on. That would have been 2015. And at that stage, like it made a lot of sense for that organization because we were so new. And the premise of an incubator, for those that aren't familiar, is basically a venture capital fund invests money into you, and then to receive or to better control their returns on their investment, they put you through an education program of 4 months in this case. And as Jordana was explaining, they put you in contact with potential mentors, peers, customers. They run you through basically an education school. And you generally, if you're at the right stage, you turn out a lot better. Mm-hmm. For some, it just is a crazy distraction, and it actually probably limits your growth. And I think now there's so many of those incubators, you see it in Calgary, that it's a distraction. Like if you want, and there's competition for the same space. So for example, my friend and I were looking at agricultural incubators because he had agricultural tech, and there's so much competition and they overlap. And then which one do you go with? And then if you do this one, you can't get into this one. And then it just, eventually it's almost like the false accolades too. You're just distracting yourself.
Gary Vee said on stage at Inventures, we've almost created this environment of professional fundraisers, not people building good, sustainable companies. And I think you're kind of touching on something similar, which is, people are obsessed with getting into these incubators and accelerators. And I think it's
busy work.
It can be busy work. It can be. And as you said, there can be the right program for you, but there's so much noise now in the system that how do you know which incubator accelerator is going to help you at which stage? And so that can be tricky.
You need a startup shaman,
essentially. Yeah. That's actually it. We need a startup shaman. This is right.
That's going to become a new platform to help out startups navigate what they need to know. Because you get everything from funding to education to sales to marketing to, sales and marketing are now blended if you're into that revenue model.
Yeah.
And then like the culture programs, and it's a lot. And you're just sitting there and it's like, I'm just trying to figure out how to set up my bank account.
Exactly. Yeah, so if you're someone in the ecosystem and you're listening, shout out to you because we're doing hard work. But I will say, let's just be more transparent about what startups should expect to receive from a program. Mm-hmm. We don't need to be all things to all people. Let's find our niches and be really clear about what the outcomes are for those startups. So
and be comfortable to move people into other organizations and other incubators.
Exactly.
You don't have to hog them to yourself.
Exactly. Which folks do. They do. But again, going back to the way that we incentivize and fund these organizations, the metrics around total number of startups created, how much money did that startup generate, can we take accountability for that? Or can we say that we did that? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Those are tricky metrics because now the incubator accelerators are looking for those folks that are going to create those metrics, and we're not necessarily serving the entrepreneurs that might need access to that knowledge, and maybe down the line are going to be the ones that create those jobs and that revenue. But I do want to take it back to the social space and just say that what I find tricky if you're an entrepreneur that's trying to innovate in the social space is more often than not, you don't necessarily fit into those types of programs. I had a founder say to me just last week, he had done the Calgary version of 500 startups, and in his experience, he didn't feel they understood the heart of his business, what the why, the social impact he was trying to create.
He couldn't fit in their mold.
He couldn't fit in their mold, but when he kind of was moving in the social impact spaces, they don't necessarily understand the commitment to revenue, the commitment to building a business. So we need to really be able to find that middle ground, and that's what we were trying to build with some of the initiatives that we were working on at Innovate Calgary, but also that other folks kind of around Canada and beyond are also trying to create, but that intersection of you can create a good cash flow business. You can create an incredibly scalable business while also having social impact, but we don't necessarily want to jeopardize the social impact just to hit those revenue targets.
Yeah.
It's a dance.
That is a very big dance. That is a teeter-totter. If I ever heard it. You lived and worked all over based off of what I saw on LinkedIn. You were in Calgary, you were in Montreal, Bolivia, New York, Washington, D.C. You mentioned Italy as well. How have these places shaped your worldview and approach to systems change?
Massively, and that's because you get to swim in different waters. One of my good friends, Jerome Morgan, who's now leading the hub, says a fish doesn't know the water they swim in. And it really resonated with me because you don't recognize the culture that you operate in. This is starkly obvious to me moving down to the US most recently. Even just the type of access to media and conversations folks are having in different spaces and different cultures varies widely. And so by immersing myself fully in those cultures, in some cases trying to learning the language more successfully and less successfully in certain contexts. I will say Chilean Spanish is particularly hard for me.
Okay.
And we worked with Mapuche women who are indigenous down in Chile, so it made it extra hard to learn the language. They blend them. But like I said, language shapes culture. I digress. But trying to learn the language, having just really honest conversations with people about what they're experiencing, just completely shifted my reality. The culture that I grew up in and the waters that I swim in, that's one perspective. There's not a right way to build a robust society, to create resilient communities, to have inclusive economic development. And that's sort of the mission that I'm on, is to try to work towards those things. And so to be able to pull what works and what doesn't work from different cultures, and to just have that openness to trying to arrive at a better truth, but not to say that, there's one way to do something.
What I liked about that was that you're able to take from other areas to infuse and enrich another area. But then by accepting the fact that you don't have to necessarily make it the exact same is a beautiful concept. And I think that's what globalization is about. If you don't like this particular ecosystem, you have the ability to now move to another ecosystem too. and what works there doesn't necessarily have to work, as you said, in another place.
Can I just build on that?
Yeah.
Building on what you said, I think I'm not a fan of shoulds, but unfortunately I'm going to say should.
Okay.
I think people should experience other culture. I think you should try to move what you're doing somewhere else at some point so that you can develop that openness, just like I think folks should at some point in their lives work in the service industry because it's a great foundational.
Gives empathy.
It gives empathy. It teaches you not to be an asshole.
Yeah. The no asshole rule might have started if you had experience working in a restaurant, that's for sure.
Exactly.
You mentioned lobbying in Washington to improve components to the university that you're working at. Can you maybe dive into that a little bit?
Yeah,
what does that
for
look
sure.
like?
You know, day on the Hill, you go from congressperson's room to senators, and you basically sit down with folks. You've got 10 minutes to make your piece, make your pitch.
This is speed dating in the government.
Speed dating in the government. But we got more time, so folks were interested in the message and what we were talking about. So this is through the university, what's it called? Autumn Association of University Technology Managers. So under that guise, we were on the Hill trying to share the message of how important universities are in terms of economic development and the creation of innovation right now. You know, a lot of folks perceive innovation to mostly happen in industry, and that's partially true. You know, the Googles are going to do it. Well, where did Google come from?
Wasn't it
Stanford.
Students out of Stanford?
Stanford Lab, exactly. So a lot of hard problems we need universities to help solve, because sometimes research can be, you have to be very patient, you know, and a lot of strong, very transformational innovation happened almost accidentally, right? Insulin as an example. So within the university context, we have the systems in place to do that more patient research. If you think about pharmaceutical drug discovery, big pharma hasn't really discovered a drug since the 80s. Like, most of that is done in universities, and then that knowledge is transferred. So the message we were trying to get across is universities are play a critical role in innovation development, in economic development. And, you know, we know that there are challenges in this model. Like, a lot can change in universities to have that, you know, greater synergy between the research that happens on campus and how it gets implemented, whether it's in a startup context or, you know, even in an industry context. So yeah, that's what we were up to. I think the other piece that's important is there's a direct correlation between investment in research, publicly funded research, and the number of patents filed. And so China is doubling down right now on not necessarily filing patents, IP in China, but doubling down on investment into R&D. So yeah, it's something that we are declining in this current regime, and we have to
in the U.S. or also in Canada? In
the U.S. primarily. I think Canada is a last frontier, but there were certainly some risks to that as well because of the public perception. You know, public perception. You're sitting in an ivory tower. What do you do for us? And you know, you asked about why is social innovation so important now? One of the things that universities do when they're working in social innovation, they're often working with community partners to develop new solutions. As an example, how do you keep at-risk youth off the street, youth that are at risk from gang violence, as an example? An academic researcher isn't just going to sit in an ivory tower and think about that idea. They're going to be working with community partners already. They're going to develop a solution that a nonprofit can operationalize, and that's happening. And so I think social innovation in that context is the opportunity to communicate to people the impact that is being had from this public funding.
Wow. That just gives me the idea that I have to do a lot more research on this stuff, because it's involved in so many other components of life. And as I said in the intro, it's just things that you don't see. So this is an out of left field question, but what book are you reading right now?
Oh, see, I'm one of those people that reads multiple books all at once. So I'm rereading Capital in the 21st Century, Thomas Piketty. I started rereading that because, as I mentioned to you earlier, I'm really interested in inequality right now and the long-term impacts from inequality. And so Piketty has this incredible, and I have to say, I have to shout out to a friend of mine who reminded me to pick this up again, the folks up at Sparrow Capital, Antoine. So thank you, Antoine. But, you know, R is greater than G is the kind of main takeaway of capital in the 21st century. And that means the rate of return on capital is exceeding the growth rate of the economy in the United States, but also in most modernized economies post-industrial revolution. What does that mean? Well, that means that wealth is being accumulated to capital owners. And we think, okay, well, that's cool. I own my house, or, that's great. I have some investments in the stock market. But the accelerated rate of accumulation obviously is going to get concentrated to those who own more capital. And the income share back to labor is just plateauing. So that, the rich get richer and, the rest of us, we'll see. And so maybe
that declining middle class.
A declining middle class, exactly. And declining middle class is not good for the economy because the middle class are major consumers, right? So that's a challenge. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, but what happens when we have massive income inequality is that we end up with social unrest. And social unrest is disruptive to our entire way of being.
Everything.
Exactly. So if you're an entrepreneur, why would this matter to you? I'm going to exit my business, so I'll be fine. Well, you won't be fine if, you can't leave your house because there's protests, or worse than that, you've got folks literally revolting and breaking into your home. So
if it was more like Brazil in terms of...
More like Brazil.
Yeah, you're getting held hostage or something like that for that big discrepancy in wealth.
Exactly. So that's one. I'm reading another. So I mentioned to you so that one's an audiobook. You can't read Piketty as an audiobook. There's too many graphs. The second book that I'm reading is Journey of Souls. A friend recommended it to me after my grandma passed recently. And it's quite interesting because he's exploring the space of what he calls the superconscious. And so that's sort of like the soul world or whatever. But that came out of his counseling practice because he practices hypnosis. He's a clinical psychologist. And he kind of opens up the book saying, I never thought that I would be here, but this is 20 years of research, kind of trying to figure out what the soul is.
Jeez. No light reading at your household, hey?
I was just talking with some friends. If you have fiction recommendations, I am trying to find fiction that I can get into.
So I was a big reader for several years, and I kind of go through cycles where then I'm off of it for a bit. But I found that the reason why I needed to cycle off of these books was because I was just literally reading textbooks.
Yeah.
And you can't do that after a particularly mentally draining day.
Yeah.
So then I just avoided reading, but you need fiction for that mental escape.
Exactly.
And it's a total different type. And so.
Though I will say there are, Journey of Souls is that's a bit of a break for me because he's a storyteller. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, that's why I listen to it in audio or when I'm running.
Okay. Angel investing and betting on others. How did you get into angel and impact investing, and what initially drew you to it?
Couple things. So one, I like to put my money where my mouth is.
Fantastic
concept.
concept.
I started making angel investments in 2017, very small. So small investments that I considered that within my capacity financially that I almost considered like my charitable giving. So I look at those as, of course, I hope that they are good bets and I hope that those have a return, but I'm also investing in people and ideas that I believe in, and in particular ideas that I think are going to change the world in a positive way, like virtual gurus as an example. Well, like all of those investments, sustainable food systems, reducing addiction and rehabilitation, education. So those are all areas that matter to me. And those are both entrepreneurs I want to bet on and ideas that I want to bet on.
Nice. So did you kind of like a VC fund, did you kind of sit down with yourself and say, here are the baskets I want to put my money into, and then you found the companies, or did these companies come to you and then you're like, well, these are actually always been issues that I've wanted to help with, and then you just put the money there?
Yeah, so I would say my personal thesis is less refined than a VC would be.
Of course.
And of course, it's a little bit about my network, right? So in the latter case, as you said, folks that come to you, I meet a lot of social entrepreneurs in my work, obviously. And so I do have the opportunity to see a lot of different deals. And in terms of impact areas, the main thing that's important to me is that it is societal impact that's aligned to my value.
Looking back, what's been one of the most memorable investments you've made, either because it worked out or because it taught you something unexpected?
Yeah, so the most memorable investment, so of the investments I've made, a couple have failed. So I'm happy about that because it's been since 2017 and that, that's a good track record. I also shout out to the investors. I also think that's why investing in mission-driven founders is really important, because the tenacity they have of solving that social problem is massive. So a lot of persistence in these founders, and that's for better or worse, let's just say.
Yeah.
But one of those memorable investments, it was really near and dear to my heart, and they did end up having to wrap up. And the reason it's so memorable to me is it taught me a very valuable lesson in investing, which is when that entrepreneur comes to you for more capital in a little bit of a panic, you want to be very mindful of the context, right? And so once bitten, twice shy, I took that lesson forward with me to the Social Impact Fund. And we did make follow-on investments with a number of founders in contexts where, it was a little bit tricky and we were a bit nervous, but we wanted to believe in that founder and really double down. But my intuition around, okay, this is not the situation we want to double down on, got quite sharpened in that situation. Because I could just kind of feel, okay, I've been here before, and there's just something different in the conversation. So I will never regret that investment. It was one of my largest angel investments, but because I doubled down. But I wouldn't regret it because it was in an area that was really meaningful to me around addiction rehabilitation. And like I said, the bets that I like to make are on founders that I believe in, areas that I think we need to solve those problems. So even if that investment fails, like, we're kicking the can forward in trying to solve that problem. And so that's quite meaningful to me.
And still have a relationship with this particular founder?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Very
That's
good,
awesome.
Very good friend.
That's awesome. What do you look for in a founder or a team when deciding to invest, not just on paper, but intrinsically?
Yeah, intrinsically. So, commitment to the problem, it sounds so obvious, but again, this is why I like the social impact space. Is this just an idea you came up with that you're looking to start a business in? How much have you thought about it? How much do you understand the problem? How committed are you to solving this particular problem versus looking for a solution that anyone else could solve the problem for? So yeah, commitment to the problem, understanding of the problem sounds obvious, but I think a lot of folks are interested in entrepreneurship. Everyone wants to be a founder these days. And so I'm wary of people that are just sort of chasing an idea so that they can be a founder.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you, Hollywood, for that one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Second thing I look for is like transparency and honesty. Can we build a real relationship? Much like a marriage, folks say that all the time, but when you're having challenges, are you going to come to me and be honest about it so that we can get through that together, so that I can, help open up my network for you?
Not going to tell me what you think I need to hear.
What exactly? And then especially at the beginning when you're building that relationship, there's nothing I dislike more than when folks are like, there's no competition. We've done all the research. Like, everyone's going to buy this. Immediately, I'm like, I just can't have this conversation anymore, because A, that can't be true, but B, I just know that you're trying to sell me instead of trying to understand, also, am I the right partner for you? Kind of vice versa, whether that's through the fund or kind of individually.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of people that think it's in their best interest to show that there is no competition, but it just shows a lack of hubris that you didn't bother to find indirect competitors or, somebody else that could create it based off of their current offerings. Or, yeah, there's always something out there.
And status quo. Someone doesn't have to buy your product, right? So
that part, yes.
Status quo, if you don't think that what they're doing now is also competition, I think you're up for like an uphill battle.
Oh yeah, status quo. You experience that in all areas of your career. Right now, we're experiencing that with some technology that we're rolling out. People understand that it's better. It's more adaptive for the entire team, but they're like, we like our Google Sheets. They're just like, this is how I like it. And you're just like, okay, frick.
Exactly. And it speaks to, are you solving an urgent problem, and are you solving a problem that your customer is already trying to solve? But anyway.
Fair. Your resume shows a consistent focus on coaching and leadership development. What does that look like in your world? I'm
so interested that my resume shows that, but that's wonderful because I am interested in that. Yeah, coaching and leadership. I mean, I think it shows like coaching and leadership, it's everywhere in your life, right? Whether it's how you lead a team directly and the types of relationships you build and how you, I can't think of a better word off the top of my head, but yeah, how you empower people. I don't like the word empower.
Is it because that word's being overused now?
I think it's because I can't give you power, right? I can make
Okay.
space for you to find your own power. And maybe that's what we mean by empowerment, but that's something I can't necessarily give you in that intrinsic perspective, right?
Yeah.
Obviously we digress, but there's types of power that I can give you. Economic power, I can give you $1 million. That's a little bit different. But in that intrinsic sense, when in the coaching and leadership space. And, I think it's just an incredible skill set for any person to hone, whether you're formally a leader or informally a leader. I also very much believe in the concept, you can lead from the front, you can lead from behind, you can lead from the side. And so what that means is, we're peers. And so the way that you show up and sort of the feedback you give me, helps me shape my perspective a little bit. And that's a form of sort of like peer-to-peer leadership. I'm learning something from you. I've actually learned a lot from you today, so I appreciate that. From a formal perspective, if I'm your boss, I don't believe in that old kind of hierarchical way of leading. I'm your boss. I tell you to do something and I need you to do it. To me, it's a collaborative process of, we need to get to this objective and I need you to take ownership of this piece. Like, how are we going to get there? And then they might have a perspective and I might have a different perspective. And sometimes, sometimes their idea has to trump mine and vice versa. Or sometimes we, generate something in the middle. But that's sort of, I think that's in the workspace. And then also in your kind of personal relationships, like I have a lot of really dear friends and I invest very specifically in cultivating relationships with certain people. And there's a lot of reciprocity and like mutual leadership, I would say, in those relationships. So some of the coach training I did with VMSA, so another shout out to VMSA today, not intentional, was amazing. Like I learned that there's a difference between coaching, advising, and mentorship. That's a pillar, that's from their perspective, but it really shifted something for me because, did I say coaching, advising,
and mentorship?
Perfect. I thought I said leadership. And mentorship is something from their lens, but it resonates with me. I can say you're my mentor, but you can't say I'm your mentor. That's not what I meant to say.
I'm your mentee.
Yeah, exactly.
You're my mentee.
Exactly. Appreciate that. So I can say you're my mentor, but you can't assign that to yourself. That's mentorship. I have a lot of mentors in my life, and some of them might not even know it. Advising, so often when we are, especially in entrepreneurship spaces, but even as friends, often we think that we're helping someone and we're directly trying to give them information and advice. Really what they're looking for is to work through a process. And that's the coaching lens. So a coach as not a formal coach, big C coach, but just as a friend, as a peer, asking that person questions, trying to arrive at a solution together. And so those are some of the learnings I've taken away from some of the more formal training I've done in that space, but it shows up in your life in just so many different ways.
That coaching, advising, and mentoring component is really interesting to me because over the last couple of years, just having built up my career in sales, listening is a skill set that I've been really trying to hone in on. And it's interesting, your take on coaching and asking questions and all those sort of things. Not for anybody's fault or anything like that, but you probably see it in your own personal life. You go to somebody, you're trying to work through something and they're trying to give you the answer. They're giving you the answer. But that, like you said, you need the questions. You need somebody else to help you work through it by asking you kind of leading questions. Listening is such a component to all of those things, coaching, mentoring, advising, and it's kind of knowing which hat to wear at the appropriate time. And a large component of that is removing your ego. You're not trying to solve their issue to make yourself feel better. You're literally trying to help them come to a conclusion, and you ask them what they want. And most people will tell you, they'll tell you like, hey, I just need to be heard in this scenario, or can you give me advice and lead me down this path?
Exactly. And I would say on that, like, especially for those of us that are natural problem solvers, sometimes, actually practicing that skill is really important because it can definitely be from a place of ego. It can also just be from like, I just want to help you solve this problem. I care about you. And so I think practicing these skills is really important because it's not necessarily natural to everyone. I struggle with that a lot because I do like to solve problems. And so one of my team members used to call me her idea girl. As soon as she had a problem, she would come to me and be like, she's going to have 7 or 8 different solutions. So and so I have to pull that back when I'm trying to wear that coach hat as a friend or as a peer because, it's not where I'm naturally comfortable. And so the practice of it is important.
Yeah. The idea girl. I like that. There's always, you got the friends for different things. I have friends that always play devil's advocate, and that one's a tricky one though too. You don't always want the friend that's playing devil's advocate. You're just like, I feel like you're just borderline arguing with me for the sake of it. But anywho,
so, I can be that friend sometimes. I'm sorry.
Yeah, people do that. In your experience, what defines a great leader? Not just by title, but by presence or impact?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different types of great leaders is the first thing that I'll say. But what I'm interested in right now are leaders that can hold a vision and do help set direction for folks to move in with clarity. What I've learned and something I've struggled with is sometimes being over collaborative can be challenging. Mind you, I'm going to say something different about that in a sec. I do think leaders that can create clarity for focus for folks can be really helpful because sometimes people just do need to be led and they need to know where they're going, especially when it's formally on a team or within an organization. So that clarity of, okay, here's where we're going. Now, the collaborative element to me is, are we still going in the right direction? How are we going to get there? And then really getting out of the way for the best people. And of course, if you're working with them, they should be the best people because you want to have the best people around you. But really getting out of the way for them to be able to bring whatever their genius is forward. The last thing I'll say on that is also understanding the genius of the people that you're working with, not just their competencies or what they're really good at, but what is that realm of genius? And we often get stuck in our competencies because we're good at it. But like, how do you actually identify where is that person particularly unique and allow them to, and that's hard to do. So no criticism to folks who aren't doing that, but it's something to think about.
How do we personally approach mentorship, both being mentored and mentoring others?
So in terms of mentoring others, and I guess my experience of being a mentee, or thinking of someone as my mentor, I think it starts with just a genuine relationship. So there are a lot of relationships I've cultivated that I would consider that person my mentor, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, whether or not they know it, but they're the person I go to for a particular type of problem. So we were talking a little bit earlier as well about the friend who's constantly asking you, are you sure that's the right thing to do? If they're playing devil's advocate and it feels a little bit frustrating, but to go to that friend for a particular thing. So I think the reason I said genuine relationship is I want to understand the people that I'm asking for advice from in different contexts. I want to understand them on a personal level. Do our values align? Because is the information or the advice I'm receiving from them going to be something that is actually applicable or not? And then also, what are their skill sets and what's their zone of genius, if we can figure that out. I've got a mentor, Julian Norris, and he is a little bit of a wizard. He's also in the social innovation space but has worked in corporate, has worked in a nonprofit. He's kind of all over the place. But I go to him when I'm working through something that is very hard to touch.
Okay.
You know what I mean? So
he's out of reach kind of thing?
It's abstract. And I need some advice on sort of moving through this abstract space in contrast to how do I close this deal? Right. So I have a lot of folks and I guess that, now I'm thinking about it. And again, I have to say Roy Group were the folks who talk about they do the training for VMSA. So I would feel badly if I didn't mention them, but mentorship advising and coaching, I guess, in that mentorship perspective, when I'm going to someone for advice that's more tactical, maybe that is just actually advising. So that's something to think about. When I think about mentees, similar, creating space for folks to be their authentic selves and trying to make sure that folks would never feel judged. I'm really proud that I think I was almost always the first person, maybe not the first, their partners or a few close friends, but I always said to folks on my team, if you're thinking about leaving, I do not want to be the last person to know because I'm not going to penalize you for thinking about leaving. I think about leaving all the time,
daily fights.
8 years later, I'm still here. So you can still grow in this organization, even if, you're thinking about other things. But I want to really understand, what is your journey and where are you trying to go? And creating that space for people to be their authentic selves and to work through things, I think is part of being a good mentor. And it goes back to that genuine relationship piece.
Yeah. Mentorship's such a interesting part of this podcast is just hearing how people view mentorship. And like you said, some people don't even know that you're being mentored by them. I have Richard Branson is definitely my mentor. He doesn't know it yet, but always appreciated kind of how he does business. And then I have some of other ones here in Calgary, but yeah, mentorship, it just highlights we can't do it alone. And it's also realizing that we need to seek out people that we would like to model ourselves after. And I look at mentorship for components that I'd like to model off of. If I could have basically the ideal person, like he is a father, startup founder, what do you call it? Morally just, all of them, all in one person, awesome. But sometimes I have to be like, this is a real good salesperson, because that's the component that I need to be breaking down.
Exactly.
Right. And yeah, so I appreciate you sharing that.
Can I just say, I appreciate you mentioning Richard Branson is your mentor, because I think people get a bit overwhelmed if maybe they don't have the network of people around them that are modeling out the lifestyle that they want or the ways of being that they want. And so you can find mentorship through authors or, through people's podcasts. And I think that's really important, of not only being mindful of the people who are physically around you, but also being mindful of, what you're consuming more broadly and how that shapes your perspective.
Yeah, what you're consuming is very important. Another mentor, Chris Williamson. He doesn't know me yet, but I hope he does one day. He's another great podcaster that's just a simple person by all means that has taken such an initiative to learn about cognitive behaviors and all these other components. And his podcast is, I think it's one of the top 5 globally.
Amazing.
And it took him 8 years to get to that point, and he just went after it, and just his focus. And yeah, good British guy that I really appreciate. So I like modeling some of my stuff after what he's doing, and it's because he's doing such a great job. So awesome. What's that saying? Mimicry is the best
form of flattery.
Yeah, there you go. Mimicry is the best form of flattery. And that's what I'm doing. So when you were younger, what did you imagine you'd grow up to be? And does any of this still show up in your work today?
It's funny. So I mentioned that my grandma passed, so I was in her home kind of going through all of her things, and I have all my childhood sentimental thing in her home in the basement that I had to haul back here now. So I digress for a second, but it was a really beautiful journey of, I think we need to develop these time capsules and go back to them in periods, because I forgot certain parts of myself. As our memories don't serve us particularly well all the time. And so it was really neat to go back and say, oh, who was that 5-year-old? Who was that 10-year-old? So I didn't remember this, but I guess the first thing I wanted to be when I was a kid was an artist. I'm not formally an artist in any way, but I do love aesthetic things. I love artwork. I love artistry and creativity. And I think how that shows up for me today is that I try to cultivate beautiful spaces. If you haven't been to the Social Innovation Hub, I think it's pretty cool for the budget that we had. We worked with an artist, Keegan Starlight, to come in and do the mural at the very front. It's gorgeous, and I think it has good vibes. You should have seen it before. But yeah, those are some of the ways that it shows up in my life now. And then the thing I remembered wanting to be for most of my life was a lawyer. And I think that's because I was always told, you're good at arguing. My dad could not win an argument with me. He wanted me to be a judge. And I thought I was going to be a lawyer all through the beginning of university, studied political science, thought I would then go into law. Then I fell in love with political economy again, and startups and innovation. Again, we digress. But it's funny because those memories of who I was then, though they don't show up in an explicit way in who I am now, they sort of really carry forward. And what I do love about law, one, I got into IP initially because I just do find the details of law interesting, even though I never studied it. And then I also just love trying to be objective about the facts and sort of looking at something from both sides and sort of letting the facts reveal the truth, let's say.
I think part of the reason why we don't do the capsules anymore is hoarding is not sexy.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, it's just not the same. That generation that had all of these, every art piece you ever did in kindergarten and your first cut of and your first tooth, that doesn't happen as much anymore.
Can I offer some unsolicited advice to the audience? I totally agree with you. And actually, one of my best friends, a startup founder down in Austin, Texas, who is revolutionizing the way that we memorialize people through turning ashes into diamonds, a rad woman. She reminded me of this capsule idea. And so when I was going through all of my stuff, it's not about keeping the first piece of hair, which, by the way, I hate to say it, but I found in my caps, in the stuff. I don't even know if it was mine. It just has a date on it.
Okay.
But what she did, and I'm trying to kind of mirror that, and is just keep certain pieces that really like remind you of a particular memory or inspire you. And she cultivated it in an intentional way so that she could actually go back through it every once in a while. And so I think there is a middle ground, I guess. And we might be swinging, I think we might be swinging too far away from preserving history and artifacts. Artifacts are a part of culture, and that's both in a kind of macro way, but also in kind of an individual way. And so it's not about just keeping the stuff, but it's about cultivating the artifacts, symbolize where you've been and maybe even where you're going.
I wonder, and this might just be going a little too extreme, I wonder if it's because we get crucified now for opinions that we had so far back, and now with the internet, like, you can literally dig these things up. So is it best to just bury it? What gives you hope that Alberta or Canada can be a real leader in social and environmental problem solving?
A lot of things, actually. So I came back to Alberta, I say kicking and screaming. I moved back, now it was 12 years ago or so. And as you saw in my resume, I had been traveling a lot. I'd already worked internationally a number of times, and I thought my journey was going to be more nomadic. I thought I would be back to New York. That was my original plan. I still have a 438 Montreal number. Out east was where my network was. But I came back for family, and then I fell in love because there's so much entrepreneurship. Like, the backbone of Alberta is really built on people solving problems. And I think that's really fascinating. The other piece is obviously, it's just a beautiful space. So it's easy to understand how important environmental sustainability is when you can go to Lake Louise and you can see how pristine the water is, and you have traveled other places and you go, I don't want that for us. Like, I don't want garbage in the streets. So again, like I said, with the natural beauty, I think you appreciate some of the important elements of sustainability. And then fast forward to sort of how that relates to the hope for Alberta. I love that we're diversifying right now through technology and innovation. I think we have an opportunity to look at what has happened in places like Silicon Valley and say, okay, but there's a lot of inequality there. What can we learn from that and leapfrog? Just like, the ICT leapfrogging that they did all over Africa. You don't need to build the hard infrastructure anymore. And so how do we do that here? I think the hope for social innovation is that we look at how we're building communities, how we are building businesses, the culture that we're building in businesses, the values that we hold as a society, and then making sure that there's resilience in those communities, there's inclusion in our economic development, there's inclusion in how we design the outcomes for our businesses. We're just kind of being mindful of what kind of society we're cultivating. I will mention a gentleman named Michael Sandel. He wrote a book called What Money Can't Buy, I think. But what he talks about, moral limits of markets, he talks about how in this sort of like modern industrial world, post-industrial revolution world, we've moved away from market economies to market societies, meaning that the values of capitalism aren't just embedded in our economy, they're embedded in how we interact almost in totality. Think about, we've seen business model advancements like to SaaS. Like a lot of folks want that recurring revenue, software as a service. How does that impact the idea of ownership for younger generations who now think of so many different services
on a monthly basis? So that was really an interesting insight to me around how the types of businesses that we're cultivating actually impact us on a cultural and societal level. And so again, the hope that I hold for the future of social innovation in this province, in our country, is that we are thinking in a totality about the complexity of the world around us, and then we're trying to be intentional about cultivating something that we would be really proud of, and that
will live on for generations. You said folks who are parents, like a lot of people are scared to have kids right now, but we shouldn't be, because let's try to be more imaginative in designing the future that we want our kids to be able to live in. And I think the kind of merger of social innovation and the entrepreneurship innovation ecosystems is how we're going to be able to cultivate those types of solutions.
Well said. What does success mean to you?
I should have known you were going to ask that based on your podcast. It's funny because you're asking me this question at a really interesting time where I did resign from Innovate Calgary. I was there for 10 years. I mentioned things have changed in my family, so I don't have a tie to Alberta anymore. An explicit tie to Alberta. I don't have to be here, let's say. I have a community that I love, and both from a professional and personal perspective. And I mentioned, I see a lot of opportunity here for us to create the future that we want to live in, and I think that's really exciting. But I bring this kind of juncture up when you ask the question around success, because I'm sort of in this phase of redefining so much about myself and what I want in the future. And right now, success to me feels like, one, being able to live my life out through the values that I have. And so there is an element of financial success in that. I want to be able to continue to invest in startups. I want to be able to have the means to be able to create spaces for people to be able to live out their own values too. But yeah, it's so interesting. Success right now for me is really about understanding your individual purpose. We talked about zone of genius a little bit, kind of understanding not the existential, why am I here, but understanding sort of what you're able to contribute to this world and sort of what you're here to uniquely do. And then to live that through from a sense of centeredness and I went through a phase of having all of these goals and pushing to get there and succeeding in a lot of that. And I was really pleased with that. But I'm sort of, success to me today means a lot more centeredness and groundedness in the way that things unfold. Still having goals and wanting to work towards those, but being a lot more open to what organically is unfolding. And so it's a little bit about just a way of being. And yeah, so I feel like it's a bit of a weird answer, but you've caught me at a bit of a weird time.
I think what I've realized through this podcast is success and people's views on success is continuously changing. So to say what success looked like to you at the early stage of your career, it's probably safe to assume that it's not the same as it is now. There's obviously people that are very goal forward and stuff like that, but it does change. I feel like success is very much a feeling at the end of the day too. And so you being at maybe not a crossroads, but at a junction in your life, you're going through emotional stuff. So obviously success is going to change because it's tied to that a little bit.
Yeah, it's almost like a threshold, right? It's it's an individual personal evolution. Think of the snake. I guess this year is the year of the snake. Someone told me that because I have a snake on one of my necklaces. And I was like, oh, that's cool. I was born in 1989, so I'm a snake. But I love the analogy of the snake and that it is the year of the snake because, you're shedding a layer. And in humans, we do that. Our body does regenerate a 7-year cycle. So we're quite literally changing.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think success is an evolving concept because we are constantly evolving. And I also think that there is something a little bit more poignant, I guess, from a societal perspective. We've seen a lot of our systems collapse. Yeah. There's a lot of fragility, everything from COVID to what's happened politically all across the world and economically what's happened right now. So I think people are also in this moment redefining success because what we've been doing as a society hasn't been working. And so what's our how does that impact us then individually? It hasn't been working in my perspective, maybe not to everyone.
Humans intrinsically like to fix things.
I agree.
So if something's not working for us, we're going to try and figure it out. So
exactly.
That's why you're here. You've spent your career helping others build impact. What do you hope your own impact will be? I talked about this, but I'm really quite committed right now to more equitable economic systems because I think, I had said earlier, I don't think you can
give people power per se. But I do think that economic equity is one way to shift power so that we have more people participating. Like, I'm a big believer that the more diverse our workforce is, the more diverse our innovators are, founders who are accessing capital, the more types of solutions we're going to get, because
that cross-pollination.
People are bringing different perspectives, different life experiences. And so, I'm really positive on what we can do as a species if we allow more people to participate. So I really hope that part of what I'm able to leave behind from an impact perspective is creating opportunities for more people to participate. I love the tech space, we talked about that, but I also am a big fan of good cash flow businesses that are the backbone of our society, not the sexy stuff that hire people. HVAC's not particularly sexy, but I think, as an
dirty
industry,
hands, clean money.
It's the backbone of our society in a lot of ways, not just HVAC. But I hope that those businesses are able to continue, and I hope that we continue to create jobs for people in this AI revolution. I know that the type of work people are doing is going to change. I'm not a believer that, all the jobs are going to be gone. I think the jobs will just change.
Yeah, of course.
1900s, if you can actually go back and look at
100 years ago.
Artifacts are important. You can go back and look at the newspapers, and you can see that in New York, people were losing their minds because kerosene, there were the people who had to climb up and light the lamps. And when electricity was
losing their jobs,
being distributed, the world was going to change. All of these men were going to be unemployed, which whatever, the jobs changed. So the point being that I think while we are facing a massive amount of technological disruption, and, we're going to be okay, but things are going to be different, just making sure that there is an equitable level of participation in that.
That was good. Last question. If you could go back and sit with a younger version of yourself just before stepping into this space, what would you tell her?
Oh my God. The first thing I think of is don't go.
Don't do it.
Don't do it. Follow your dreams. Be an artist. I half joke on that. I'm fully joking, because I think, the experiences that we have are what shape us. I think I would say, going back to what success means, I think I would just say, don't take yourself too seriously. It took me too long to learn that. I thought I had to fit into a particular environment, and I had to wear certain things to work because that's how it was, and kind of starting to get, and also because I was more in an institutional context, it just took me longer than I would have liked to, realize that telling silly jokes in a board meeting is absolutely fine, and the people that don't like it won't work with you, and you don't have to work with them either. So I would just say, don't take yourself so seriously, and play more in your work journey. I play a lot outside of work, whether it's playing volleyball or chasing my friend. I don't know why that would happen, but this is a real story. We'll talk about that later. But also just playing in the workplace, having fun. You can be a serious person without acting like the world is so serious all the time. Just play, make jokes, have fun. Do take yourself seriously, but not to the detriment of the people around you and your mental health.
Fair. So that brings us to the end of the podcast. I really enjoyed it. Definitely some big topics that we went over today, but for anybody who made it all the way here, I thank you very much. Please help us get this out there. Share it with your friends, your family. The community is growing. I'm really enjoying the comments that I've been receiving, but I can't do this without you. So for those that are here, thank you once again. Thank you again, Jordana.
It's been awesome. I loved getting to talk to you more.
Let's get after it.
That's how you end it?